Welcome to the Pillar Podcast, where we put racial equity front and center. Join us as we dissect equity policy, overcoming achievement gaps, and strategies that ensure equitable learning opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for all students.
Welcome to another episode of the Pillar Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Brandon, and today I have with me three wonderful individuals from the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Poverty. So bear with me as this intro might take a little bit longer than previous episodes. So I'd like to start with my first guest, Aven Cook. In her 8th year with JCPS, her work focuses on coaching and supporting classroom educators in the pursuit of culturally responsive pedagogies and practices, as well as coaching and supporting school leaders in racially equitable leadership. Aven's also a doctoral candidate at the University of Louisville in their College of Education and Human Development. Next, I have with me Rachel Klein. Rachel earned her master's degree from Western Governors University. She is currently in an EDD program at the University of Louisville. Rachel's former middle school English language arts teacher. And from then, she joined the Diversity, Equity, and Poverty team and is currently a specialist of anti-racist pedagogy. And last but surely not least, Lamanda Moore Rodriguez earned her Master's of Arts in Teaching from Bellarmine University and continued that education at Spalding in the Instructional Leadership Program. Former Equity and Inclusion Resource Teacher, Literacy Coach, and Reading Recovering Teacher, now turned specialist for Division of Diversity, Equity, and Poverty, and has presented at both district and national levels. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So happy to have you all. So today, obviously, you all are anti-racist specialists, and you all have your own unique niches within the division. So looking forward to getting to know a little bit more about you all, what you do, and how you continue to help serve and do work in the equity. Right? So, Aven, your dissertation work focuses on the implementation and monitoring of racial equity policies in public schools, which I believe is also fitting for your current role. How do you use your experience as a resource teacher and what you're doing within your dissertation work in the role that you play for DEP?
So I will say my dissertation research gave me a lot of exposure to other public school districts who are doing the work of racial equity, and I've been able to look at how things have been implemented, missteps that have occurred, and then of course looking at organizational actors such as principals or district leaders or classroom educators. We talk a lot about self-work in our day-to-day lives, and a lot of the policy enactment comes back to a willingness to engage in that self-work to be able to really commit to racial equity.
And I love how you said self-work. I want to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the meat of this. So I think that's very important in the work that we do regarding racial equity. You have to be a intentional and willing participant. So it's awesome. Rachel, you got your start as an English language arts teacher, then transitioned to a resource teacher. What was the influence, what influenced you to transition into equity work? Because that's a little different than being a English teacher.
It is. It absolutely is. But also, I will be completely transparent that where I grew up was extremely white. So having moved to Louisville and occupied a teaching position in the middle schools, I had a decision in front of me immediately to commit to the self-work or get caught up and drown, honestly, because I looked out into a sea of faces that by and large looked nothing like mine. And that really was the catalyst for me to dig my heels in. And it's an ongoing assignment that I've given myself, and I'm not going to turn it in. I can't, because I'm always revising it. So I do believe that spending time examining text and looking at different perspectives in text with students, it's not an obvious transition, but also there's so many roots in what the power of discourse and text and seeing oneself in that text and being exposed to others that really led me to pursue more of that self-work. And it, like I said, it's been ongoing, but I knew that I had a role to play, because there is nothing about this work that belongs on any one person's shoulders. As a white person, I understand that I have ally work, I have accomplice work, and like I said, it's never ending. It's always evolving, and I'm always growing toward that. And I know that I need to represent what that looks like for people who do look like me, to acknowledge that they have a place in this work, and it's very important.
And I know you do great work, and I value that. And I appreciate you. So, LaManda, you, and I say this as a quote, you're a real advocate for literacy. Almost every room I've been in with you, you say something about literacy. So I know that's a passion for you, and you're continuously encouraging students to advocate for themselves and for others. And as a former reading recovery teacher working with students hands-on and directly, did you always envision yourself doing the work from the district level, or was something different in the classroom that made you want to do the work from the district level?
Well, so first I'll say I didn't envision doing this work at the district level. I didn't even know that it was a possibility. But you know, being a teacher, specifically a Black teacher, it's important for me to think about students. And of course, JCPS serves a lot of diverse students, but making sure that those students specifically are able to speak up for themselves and advocate for what they need. And so, you know, you do that in your locus of control. You do that in your building, wherever you are. Because it's important and necessary. I didn't think about doing this work at the district level until I was introduced to the SEED cohort, which is Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, which is something that was suggested to me by Dr. Marsha Carmichael Murphy. Shout out to her. And then also Dr. Monica Lakwani. And so attending that cohort really made me see that there was an opportunity and a necessity for this work to happen at the district level. So when I heard about those positions opening up, I thought that, you know, this would be a good fit for me. And so realistically, I didn't think I would get one of those positions, but you know, here we are. Fortunately, that's where I met Avon and Rachel. So, you know, everything kind of comes full circle. So if you are looking for a cohort to participate in, please reach out to Dr. Monica Lakwani, and she can point you in the direction of our JCPS cohort for SEED.
So back in October, you three presented during our monthly NAACP JCPS Community Forum with the focus on culturally responsive curriculum. Well, first of all, thank you for doing that. And I think that was such a great forum. I immediately knew I had to have you all on the pillar. But during that forum, LaManda had introduced what you three have deemed the trinity of supports. Those supports are the ARE tool, the REAP, and the EMPTY. Either one of you, or maybe all three, just take a minute or two and kind of briefly provide context of what those tools are.
So the REAP is the Racial Equity Analysis Protocol, and what that is a set of 8 questions that our employees, our colleagues can discuss, which are going to help them lead to more equitable decision-making, whether it be in regards to a policy, practices that are happening in classrooms or across the building in general, and just procedures that are happening also across classrooms and buildings.
So in looking at what the REAP may demonstrate or show a school or a committee that's gathered around that REAP, there are going to be these realizations or these moments where the R tool might come in. And that's not for every decision that is arrived at by way of the REAP, but they often lead to each other. And so the Affirming Racial Equity tool does just that. It affirms racial equity, and it is not just curricular and instructional, but it is climate and culture. It is how we assess our students. And so it is divided into 6 components that we can talk more about in a little while. But once that is in place, then we're hopefully going to start seeing some of those shifts in terms of the practices that teachers are employing in their PLC planning, in their analysis of data, the ways in which they make selections of text and curricula, and then how they apply those through their instructional and pedagogical decisions.
And then, of course, the EMPTY, the Equity Monitoring Progress Tool, is a space where you will see the highlights, kind of the bragging points of all the progress a school has made in a given school year regarding racial equity. So within every individual school's EMPTY, you'll see many references to individual R tools, highlighting maybe a lesson or unit of study that was an exemplar. You will see racial equity analysis protocols that have been completed for a myriad of reasons or policies or topics. And then, of course, that is really what drives the work of the racial equity policy at the district level, because the expectations within the EMPTY are derived, they are derived explicitly from the JCPS racial equity policy. So if you look at the language of the two, they very much align. And together, those 3 documents, we really do refer to the DEP Trinity of Support because
I like that.
it really does outline where are you in the work. It highlights areas of need, it highlights areas of concern, and gives a really good gauge of where we are at a district level in the work of racial equity.
I think what's really important to note is because they are called the Trinity of Supports, they very much build each other up. And you may start with any one of those items to engage in the work. There's not maybe a delineated starting point, but once you recognize, perhaps through the REAP, that something needs to change, you're going to turn to one tool or the next, and they all build. And it's really important to note that we don't move an inch without making sure that what we develop is aligned with the racial equity policy as often as possible, and where possible, the 6 systems of JCPS, and we do our best to attend to the other 2 pillars of the district as well.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Is there a particular starting point? And given that it just makes sense, like they kind of support each other, build off of one another.
I think the starting point is really based on your role. So if you're a school leader or you're part of an administrative team, you're probably going to begin each year with a review of last year's EMPTY and setting SMART goals for the year. Whereas if you are maybe a school-based RT or you're a classroom educator, I would really assume you're beginning your school year thinking about the R tool and how various lesson descriptors fit into plans you already have, and how the R tool might encourage you to revise or revisit instructional practices from the previous school year.
Thank you for that. Well, that makes sense, right? A supportive document or multiple supportive documents, different starting points based upon your role, your contribution, kind of where you are. So I want to take the first few moments here to talk about the Affirming Racial Equity tool. We can use ARE or R tool moving forward. This resource, it's a resource for teachers to help them plan and incorporate more racially equitable practices into curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy. 6 components: content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice elimination, equitable pedagogy, empowering classroom culture, and R through assessment. I know we monitor the utilization of this tool at the district level, focusing on primarily coaching and providing resources, which ultimately ensures that all schools are supported in their pursuing of racial equity. Should each school have in-classroom racial equity goals?
Well, so I think that's not a yes or no answer, but each teacher should have a racial equity goal. So they have something that they have identified themselves that they are working towards in the whole year to change their practice, their pedagogy, their classroom environment. So yes, each teacher should have a personal racial equity goal, and to me and us, that is something that should be apparent in their classroom. So that's something that hopefully our educators are sharing with their students so they know what their goal is. And so that way students have buy-in with that as well. So thinking about how our classrooms are set up, that can be something that kind of keeps us on track or keeps our focus on thinking about racial equity. So as a part of their growth plan, this is something that helps contribute to that. So when we're thinking about doing a walkthrough in a school where it would be wonderful if we saw those posted outside the classroom, if we saw those posted inside the classroom, just for that transparency, so that our students know what we're working towards and what our goals are. We think that it's just something that teachers can and should do to show their commitment towards racial equity in their students.
And I mean, this is a great resource, but the utilization of it is not mandatory, correct?
It's not mandatory. We would love to hear that it is an expectation. Yeah. It is an expectation that we use this document as we're planning instruction, because it is a companion guide. It's something that you should have out as you're looking at either writing new curriculum, writing new lessons or units, or vetting already pre-made lesson plans or units that teachers are using in the classroom. We want to make sure that it is something that we go to inherently. It has to be a part of our processes. It's not a requirement, but we would love to hear that it is an expectation that happens within our PLCs.
I think I'd like to expand on that a bit and dispel maybe some confusion or misconceptions about the ARE tool. There are 36 lesson descriptors on there, and we know that any number that goes beyond a few different smaller expectations, it might become overwhelming. And you've talked about self-work in the past. It is not meant to be a flat or static item. It is very much meant to be dynamic, but that dynamism has to come from how our instructional leaders in our building are looking at it as a transformative tool. Sure, you can print it out, you can look at it, you can have it next to you, as we would hope is happening, but we also want people to take that and turn it into what works for them based on the practices that already exist in the school, practices they've identified that need to change. It is meant to be unpacked. It's meant to be studied, and then it's meant to be operationalized within the systems that exist in that building. And so, sure, it can be overwhelming, but let's not look at it that way. Let's look at it as something that we can begin to pull bits and pieces and insert them where it makes the most sense in a school.
Yeah. Because I would think, obviously the racial equity policy it's a policy, right? So it's embedded throughout the district, throughout each school community. So one would think, right, if we have a district policy, that a resource that's provided by the district in support of that policy would be something that is, we'll just say mandated. Like we should be utilizing the tool as a necessity, not as an option.
Some folks have come to us when they've unpacked it a little more and they've said, this is just best practices, and we wholeheartedly agree with that, but we don't want people to get away with just that blanket understanding of it, because I think best practices gets overused.
Yeah.
It is a lot of best practices, but why? Understanding the reason why it supports best practices, the reason why it exists in the first place, and what it can do. When we really start to dig deeper into it, we start to see it as something that is beneficial, and so maybe it makes it easier to see as an expectation once we really do understand that it takes a practice and makes it as good as possible, especially for our students.
And looking at how we monitor, I know as a district we monitor the racial equity progress via various metrics. I got to become familiar with a few of those when I interviewed BJ. I know you guys know BJ.
He's our
We do.
supervisor.
We've seen him
You've
once
seen
or
him
twice.
once or twice, yeah.
We have to look up pretty high to see him.
Yeah, BJ shedded some light on the various metrics that we use. And for example, increasing the number of staff that participate in culturally responsive professional developments, increasing the number of courses offered, in addition to the students that participate in those courses that pertain to to different cultural perspectives. But as it relates to providing evidence, as BJ would say, evidence for those metrics, are there a certain number of artifacts you all or we look for to see produced?
So the recommendation within the Equity Monitoring Progress Tool, the EMT, is that we are seeing culturally affirming and relevant materials, meaning those instructional materials educators are using, in 80% of the school. And that's interpreted a couple of different ways. None of them are inherently wrong. And really what we're seeking to do is flip that paradigm of white centering that often happens in public education, or whitewashing of curriculum, on its head. So some of our school leaders will think of 80%, and they will try and make sure that over the course of a school year, 80% of the content covered is going to be relevant and culturally affirming to Black and brown children. Some others may look at that and think, okay, well, this is really difficult for my faculty to do in this special area and this core content, so we're going to push really hard and make sure it's relevant and represented everywhere else. But ultimately, what we're seeking to do is really make those curricular and instructional materials match our district and school demographics.
Which, it's a tough feat. That's tough, especially when you, I guess, would have the autonomy to, I guess, utilize your own lens as to how you see that coming to fruition. Right?
Absolutely. And in coaching, that's something I think we've all heard. We tend to teach how we ourselves were taught.
Yeah.
So we're absolutely trying to build a system that does not exist yet. And it is a huge ask for our classroom educators, our school leaders, which is why we're so adamant that we offer systemic supports, because we are just 3 people and we know we can't be everything to everyone in a district of our size.
Yeah, I don't, to be honest, I don't know how you guys manage just to be the 3 of you, but you're phenomenal. And I think as we're getting into that classroom instruction, we mentioned earlier that self-work, right? So in order to produce an artifact or execute instruction or curriculum that is culturally responsive, that self-work is necessary. So when we talk about teachers doing self-work, this self-work is helping educators become certain and more aware of their own implicit biases within the classroom. So should should an educator have a certain level of self-work completed before attempting to implement culturally responsive curriculum in their classroom?
No. I think you need to start. You need to start somewhere. If you're willing to engage in this work, then we're able to work with you and help coach you to where you need to be. However, teachers have to be of the mindset that obviously we know we're lifelong learners. We're in this profession. We're not going to stop. You're passionate about this. You care about kids. Your practice has to change as the years go by. So if you are a teacher and you're staying static, then that means we're not doing that self-work. It takes ongoing self-work in order for you to continue to want to engage with this work, because you might come up against a wall and you're thinking, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to go from here. Well, if you're a teacher who doesn't really believe in this work, you're going to stop. But if you're a teacher who really believes in this work and wants what's best for our kids, then I'm going to ask for the support. I'm going to do research on my own. I'm going to read a professional text. I'm going to go to a professional development. I'm going to listen to a webinar. I'm going to do something to continue to grow my scholarly acumen, because as teachers, it is our job to just stay abreast of what's happening in the world and what's happening in education. And making sure that we take all of that and put that back into our classroom for however that works best for our kids. But the important part there to know is you have to do something continuously and make sure this is a part of just who you are and a part of your practice.
Rachel mentioned earlier that a lot of her work with diverse students made her begin that self-work. Yeah. And I think that's a reality for a lot of our educators. We are, by and large, at a national level, a profession that is comprised of white women with kind of shared cultural understandings. And when you throw educators into a district that is as black and brown as JCPS, there's a little bit of kind of cultural dissonance that teachers have to be, that classroom educators have to be willing to explore. And to Lamanda's point, we just want you open and coachable. There is no gold star, there is no checkbox, there is no grade, because if you are pursuing anti-racism, which we are, there's not an end goal. We're talking about system disruption at interpersonal and national levels. So you are beginning a journey that you have to accept is never going to end. So the point is get started.
Get started, yeah.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that educators have end goals in mind, because that's what we do with our students. We are working them towards goals. And so for ourselves, I think the fact that this is so ongoing, it is such a, I'm not going to say new, but overdue and therefore much needed, and now we're really speeding through some things at times. But we want to say I've arrived. We want to say I've done it. I've accomplished it, and that's not that's an impossibility. And so the next best thing we can ask for is that open mind, that willingness, that coachability, and that means discomfort is part of what we have to rest with, and that's not easy, especially just being a human. We like things to be clear-cut, and when there is no clear-cut finality to it, that doesn't sit well with everybody. And so it might be easy to throw in the towel and give up, but Lamanda says you have to start. You start somewhere, wherever that is. We are always inching toward being better.
Which I think that self-work, that being coachable, being willing, the willingness to be coachable ultimately helps culture and climate, right? Mm-hmm. Culture and climate helps to, I would say, produce a more well-rounded classroom. So speaking of culture and climate, that's been a big topic. It's been mentioned on the Pillar numerous times, and it's a major component of the racial equity policy and a lesson descriptor within the ARE tool. How can we gauge the improvement of a PLC or a school community's culture and climate?
I think a huge part of that is student voice. We have specific metrics that are utilized pretty consistently across the district and amongst the various levels of schools. But when we see those really big shifts happening, what we also see is a centering of students' voices, students' lived experiences, and students' home cultures, not just being affirmed, but really being honored in that school space. So, of course, we'll see things like the Kentucky Impact Survey, comprehensive school survey results, TEL surveys, but the most impressive results really do come from when administrators and administrative teams dig in with the kids to hear student voice on their perspective and move from there.
And even when it comes to just the classroom level, is that teacher soliciting that feedback from her students? Are her students, do they feel like their teacher would listen to their input if they had that? So that is something that in an empowering classroom, students would feel comfortable to say, I would love to learn about this. Is there somewhere we can, put this into our classroom because it interests me? And the teacher, being, that responsive practitioner, is going to listen to the child and say, absolutely, let's see where we can fit that in. So I think some of those smaller wins are specifically in the classroom with our students in that teacher correspondence.
And I would hope that maybe the next iteration or where we move from there, once we have centered that voice, we've centered identity, we are making spaces that affirm who sits in our classrooms, I would hope that we can develop the humility and the humbleness when a student says to one of us, that didn't sit right with me. I know you weren't trying to be hurtful, but right now I am hurt. I am offended. You've said something that doesn't sit with me. And to allow that to be a natural conversation that grows both individuals and doesn't result in anger or, pushing that child out or away, instead saying, oh my gosh, thank you for that. That is something I've never considered, and as a result, I am going to be better for you and for future students.
And I think that really circles back to the acceptance that if you are a classroom educator who is white, who is seeking to be a true ally towards anti-racism, we've got to engage in that self-work. Rita Pearson has a really epic TED Talk that's well known, and she's quoted as saying, children don't learn from people they don't like. And yes, within JCPS, that's understood through a racial lens because of our demographics between our classroom educators and students. But what Rachel just modeled should be done between all adults and all children. You should have that relationship in your classroom that a student can look you in the face and tell you the truth about something, and it be taken seriously rather than taken personally.
And that's the difference. I think definitely in my experience, when I've voiced concern or just sharing with a teacher my thoughts, you're kind of looked at as that's not your place. Like I'm teacher, you're student, and that's the end of it. Which it doesn't have to be, and honestly shouldn't be, to be honest. So when we talk about, I want to kind of shift to implementation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially the implementation of the supportive tools are adopted within PLCs. Is that correct?
It depends largely on the tool. So, for example, the R tool, absolutely. That needs to be pushed by the AICs, by our administrative teams, but that work is really best done in community, so PLCs is a natural PLCs are a natural entry point, whereas things like REAP or empties, again, it's about where the work begins. That wouldn't necessarily begin with our classroom educators.
Gotcha. And I know this isn't, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to extend on that, Avon, because when we think about our resources and when we think about making sure that we're supporting teachers and making sure our work is all aligned, there is a document that we have to help them embed the R tool into their PLC practices, so that R tool and PLC alignment framework is something that is going to be very integral to PLCs as they're beginning this work. So starting at the beginning of the year, it gives you steps and questions to ask to make sure that the R tool is a focus of your PLC across the year.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think one final note, in the instructional landscape of any given school, if the academic instructional coach, the assistant principals, and the principals do not have a common vision for what instruction and pedagogy look like, then you are going to see different versions of implementation or lack thereof across PLCs. So that common vision is key, and to communicate that and to support that from that leadership perspective.
And I kind of jumped ahead, but for those that may not know what a PLC is, what is a PLC?
PLC stands for Professional Learning Community. You may also hear the term PLN, which typically is defined as a professional learning network. So PLCs are meant to happen with grade level teams, or if you're secondary, maybe with your content area team. And it is a space where educators are able to engage in common planning, build common formative assessments, and for a lot of the work that we particularly encourage, that self-work piece around culturally responsive teaching and racial equity, it is a natural kind of community for educators to cultivate.
Thank you. So kind of want to shift gears a little bit. We talked about the R tool for a little bit. I want to shift into the REAP. The REAP leads to more equitable decision making for policies, practices, and procedures. How do you all utilize the REAP, and when and where should the REAP be utilized, incorporated, implemented?
So for us specifically, we interact with the REAP when it comes to the equity monitoring progress tools. That is something that is the work of Dr. Vanessa McPhail in our department. But I will say, when it comes to doing that work, that is something that we want to make sure, yes, happens on our leadership teams. We're having conversations about different initiatives that might be happening in the school. We're talking about if there's any kind of inequities that might be impacting our marginalized students. And we're also thinking about having that conversation in a well-rounded group. So we need at least 3 to 5 educators to have those different perspectives when it comes to making those decisions. So yes, that is the work that happens in our leadership teams, but that's something that also has to get down to our teachers and the classroom level. So that's something that we suggest to teachers is, have you taken your classroom expectations through the REAP? Have you had that conversation? If you all are developing a new incentive or a new engagement opportunity for students and parents, have you had that conversation through the REAP to see if there's anything unintentional that might be impacting those students? And then have the opportunity to pivot and make changes based on those conversations.
So Lamanda has to go take an office hour. I have an extension to your question, and Lamanda, you can just sneak back in and we'll re-record. You're fine. It's a busy day. But I actually have an extension to Lamanda's REAP, so I will let her exit, and then I'll tell you what we get up to with LTR. Have you interviewed Selena about LTR?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay.
Well,
I just didn't know how detailed to get.
You can get as detailed as you want. They were supposed to be like 3 weeks ago.
Oh, no.
Whatever. Yeah.
Okay.
But they're been the next 2 weeks. So.
Okay. So one of our colleagues, Selena Fishback, is the director of the Louisville Teacher Residency Program. And I have the privilege of offering embedded professional development. So I get to sit with them once a month and think very deeply about how they will implement the R tool in their future spaces. And something that we actually did when we considered the component empowering classroom culture was I let them take my classroom expectations and norms through REAP, which not only gave them exposure to the REAP process, but helped them think about ways that they should keep those questions in mind when taking on their own classroom for the first time.
And I love that because, one, you're getting exposed to it before you get to the classroom, right? So I think being a new educator, you're typically more green, more raw, in my opinion, probably more receptive to tools and resources as such. But I think going through the Louisville Teacher Residency Program, as intense and supportive as that program is, I think coming into the classroom with that equitable, that racial equitable lens already is a huge, huge plus for those educators.
I think to that point, when we consider any of the Trinity, when we consider any of the items that we've created to supplement the art tool, it is a mindset shift. They're all mindset shifting items, and yes, we want them to be followed diligently from time to time, but we also want them to just kind of start to transform how we approach anything that we do. And so you make mention of those green teachers who are a bit more receptive, open, okay, this is how we do it in this district, great, sounds great to me. It begins to just be the foundation for how we navigate our classrooms, our decisions, our interactions, our selections. And so I think that's another thing, a point for dispelling the confusion around the art tool or its utility or any of these items is that, sure, they're heavy items. You've got some self-work to do. But with more and more practice with anything, whether it's riding a bike or practicing these tools, you get better with practice over time.
Over time. And during the forum you all presented on that I mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about the difference between culturally responsive teaching and curriculum versus an Afrocentric curriculum. Two completely different things.
Yes.
Right? Share with us the difference between the two. Is there a different, from your perspective and work, how you approach the two? Are there differences?
Absolutely. And I think anyone well-versed in Afrocentrism as a concept or a study would be able to very quickly tell you what I think my teammates would agree with me in saying, in that we do have Afrocentric curriculum. Grace M. James Academy of Excellence is beyond an exemplar. The work of that administrative team for those students is unparalleled. We see it occurring at W.E.B. Du Bois Academy as well, although perhaps not to the same extent. We're just going to leave it at Aswell Abdul because Dr. Hunter will come for my throat, but I'm telling the truth. So I think it's really important to accept that Afrocentrism is occurring, but it does not occur at the rate that maybe the media would have us think it does. And when we think about culturally responsive teaching, it looks markedly different. So yes, with culturally responsive teaching, we are going to see improved outcomes for Black and Brown students. However, that does not necessarily mean that the curriculum is Afrocentric in nature. A lot of time with me being previously high school, you really only saw an Afrocentric curriculum in those elective courses. So I got to teach African American Lit. That sentence in and of itself is kind of indicative of where we are. I got to teach, not we are teaching. So Afrocentrism is absolutely happening in our district, but it is only happening in pockets.
I would say that there is a far more broader awareness of cultural responsiveness, whether it is buzzwordified or genuine. There is much more awareness out there in the education sphere. And I think the most frustrating thing about it is that there's no one set of strategies that we will ever recommend to a person, because I'm going to teach my class totally different than Avon, and she's going to interact with students totally different from me, and neither is bad as long as we are aware that they're rooted in some of the deeper aspects of cultural responsiveness. So you might turn to Gloria Ladson-Billings, but I will tell a small anecdote and then we can move forward. But Avon had an office hour with an English teacher, and she was a white woman, and she said, I am not comfortable teaching the bluest eye as a white woman unless I know I can do this right. And Avon said, I appreciate you coming to me. You're going to teach it differently than I would because my perspective and my lived experience is not yours.
Yeah,
That doesn't
completely
mean you
different.
can't. It just means you might have a tad bit more homework to do, or you have a bit more intentionality before you embark on it. However, be real with your students and say, I, as a white woman, am not going to be able to teach this the way that perhaps a black or brown peer might. That said, let's attack this together and let's explore this together. And I kind of think that brings back that vulnerability.
Yeah.
You know, to just be honest with your students and say, I am not the owner of all knowledge and experiences, but you better believe I'm going to create space for you to welcome that to bring that into my room and to allow that to allow conversations to unfold and to unpack the content of a book or topic even more responsively.
I think that goes a long way. You know, I think, in my opinion, the more honest we can be with students, it helps to foster a more respectable relationship, right? Mm-hmm. To your point, I know I may not look like you, I may not talk like you, but I'm aware of that. Let's move forward. Like that goes a long way.
Awareness and acknowledging it goes far further than attempting to avoid it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have students in front of you who may or may not look like you. We know that. That's obvious. Why are we avoiding that?
Correct.
In fact, that makes our conversations more rich. We can learn from each other and with each other. And that education doesn't look like it did even 15, 20 years ago.
No.
That vulnerability, that relationship, it makes or breaks education, experiences.
It adds an authenticity when you, as an educator, either of color or an educator who is white, are able to look at a classroom of students and acknowledge the difference, because what you're also indicating is that you see them wholly and completely for who they are. So when we're thinking about vulnerability and culture and climate and building relationships, that authenticity is quite literally unparalleled in thinking about how we maneuver student-teacher relationships.
At times, we see, like, visually see and hear the district's racial equity policy referred to as equity policy or equity work. As educators, we know words matter. Is there a difference in the two? Or more specifically, does leaving out racial intentionally or unintentionally diminish the purpose and intent?
I will argue that it absolutely does, and it is something I pay very careful attention to when we have a school leader or a district leader insisting upon using the term equity when our policy is the JCPS racial equity policy. I think a lot of it comes down to perhaps fear, just because we have seen a lot of the work that our department does be very highly politicized in a way that is very draining, that can be very scary, especially if you're newer to the work. But ultimately, when we're talking about equity, I think it waters down the role of the JCPS racial equity policy in the history of our district. We admitted in May of 2018 that there are systemic issues that we as a district need to face. So it is very disheartening for me personally when I see communications or when I hear, again, district or school leaders saying, well, we have an equity team. That's fabulous. That's brilliant. I'm glad that you care about equity. But the work that the district set out to do is racial equity.
Yeah.
There's a couple things here that I want to point out, and if we as a community are unaware of, first and foremost, the redlining that has occurred in Louisville in our history that is mired in racism, and yet we have a policy that addresses racial inequities, but we don't call it out, then we are turning a blind eye or completely ignoring our history. And in this instance, it has nothing to do with blame or guilt or any of that. It has everything to do with growing together and acknowledging where we came from and where we need to get. Mm-hmm. And the policy wouldn't exist if we didn't have that stark reality that we stare down every single day. Mm-hmm. And so we often have a lot of folks who will immediately be able to glom on within the R tool to the equitable pedagogy section. Fabulous, fantastic. We love that. We want that. Equity is the goal, but it's not the biggest goal, because we are looking at our city, we are looking at our population, we are looking at the past, and we are directly addressing it with a policy that calls it out explicitly.
Yeah, and the policy, like you said, was back in 2018, right? So we're coming up on the end of that that current plan that the district voted on. How imperative is the continuation or extension of the racial equity policy?
I don't think that the importance of the racial equity policy could be understated, because again, we do have prominent district and school leaders talking broadly about equity, and again, I'm all here for it, but it ignores and truly negates what the board decreed we as a district would do in 2018. So I think it's imperative that our current board, our current leadership really do that self-work to question why we have not gotten further in the past handful of years, and to reaffirm that commitment publicly. As Rachel said, we are a deeply redlined and segregated city even in 2023, and we not only owe it to our community, we owe it to our students to ensure that we are being racially equitable. And that doesn't mean that we ignore the other aspects of identity. We have colleagues who do brilliant work around all facets of identity in our department. But again, the data is very clear, and sadly, the data has only shifted slightly. So we as a district still have work to do.
But I think that work gets to build on something that policy has begat. And so as a result, we have the equity monitoring progress tool. As a result, the six systems have now embedded language that is reflective of the racial equity policy, and some of these anchor documents to which we've referred. There are lots of celebrations that can come out of of that policy having been enacted, but have they gotten us to where we want to get? No. But has it given us the opportunity to create?
Yeah.
Most definitely. You can point your finger to many things that have come as a result. So my hope and my excitement is what's next. If we're going to continue this momentum and look at it and build on it or revise it, imagine what we will have 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited for what's next. And I know the work that you all do is important, doesn't even do it justice. You guys are always on call, always going to bat, and you're really about this work. And I know that can be, this work in general is mentally, emotionally draining. Mm-hmm. How do you all maintain self-care? How do you all balance personal life with the work that you do daily for not only the department, but JCPS as a whole?
I will be very transparent that is something I'm still trying to work out. I entered into the department literally as we shut down schools in March of 2020. Yes, so it's been a very interesting adjustment. I will say, if it weren't for LaManda Moore Rodriguez and Rachel Klein, I would lose my mind at least once a week. I truly have the most amazing, understanding, and considerate teammates I could imagine, because it is hard work. And for me personally, my lived experience, this work is my life. So there isn't really a clear delineation between my personal passions and the things I want to see happen in the world and what I have the privilege of doing day to day for this district. So when I have a better answer about self-care, I will come back onto the pillar and share that with you. But truly, really, it can be consuming. And I'm very, very thankful to have teammates who shoulder when I can't.
Yeah.
If Avon wasn't going to say it, I was. That the reliance, and I'm going to call it reliance, upon my colleagues to make it worth coming into the office every day and make it worth staring at data that's not pleasant to stare at, and it is taxing, but because I have the privilege of going to bed at night with white skin, it sits different.
Yeah.
And so I have to lean into what that privilege feels like and how it manifests, and acknowledge that I don't have the same experience as the majority of my colleagues in this department, and by and large, the Black and brown population of this city. So it looks and feels totally different from me, and I am trying to figure out how to rest with that in a way that mobilizes me and doesn't turn into guilt, because that gets me nowhere.
Gets you nowhere.
And
Absolutely.
so I have an exceptional partner at home. I have a child who is wise beyond her years in terms of listening and knowing and Mom, are you okay?
Yeah.
And because she is the child that she is, I can find ways to talk to her.
Correct, yeah.
And hearing from the innocence of a child who is now, turning the corner into that preteen, that tween age, her awareness and her innocence is going to diminish by the day.
Yeah.
And now my mantle to take up is, how do I give her the tools and the skill sets to navigate as a white child in the world, and how can she be an ally and an accomplice? And so I turn those feelings of what do I do with this into action, whether that's the work with my colleagues or with my department or just, at home too. There's work to do, and it never goes to sleep.
Well, I want to personally thank you all for the work you do. Every time I sit down with you all, I learn something new. You guys open my eyes to a lot of things, and I appreciate you for that.
Thank you.
So with that, we will conclude this episode. I'm sorry, Abdul. I'm sorry. Yeah, I want to personally just thank you all for the work that you do and continue to do.
Thank you. Thank you.
We greatly appreciate you, Ian, and we appreciate all of our DEP colleagues, because truly nothing would get done if it were not for the shared community and our amazing leadership.
Absolutely.
All right, well, pleasure to have you all. Hopefully we will have you back for hopefully a part 2.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
We'll go ahead
Sounds
and
great.
speak-